How do you become free by enslaving yourself? How do you achieve liberation through perfect self-control? How do you find happiness by optimizing your misery? These aren't abstract philosophical puzzles. They're the operating system of your life. Every notification you compulsively check, every productivity hack you implement, every moment you feel simultaneously free and utterly trapped reveals the same truth. You've become more efficient at exploiting yourself than any external authority ever could. And you call it freedom. Byung-Chul Han discovered this paradox through lived experience. He fled authoritarian Seoul for Berlin in the 1980s, seeking liberation, only to witness something more unsettling, an entire civilization exhausting itself, pursuing an impossible dream of total self-realization. What he found in the West wasn't freedom from control, but a more total form of domination, one where subjects police themselves more efficiently than any dictator ever managed. His key insight from the Burnout Society captures it perfectly. The Achievement Society develops its own particular forms of violence. These do not manifest themselves as external constraints, but as internal compulsions. This isn't academic abstraction. It's the reality of anyone who's ever experienced the strange exhaustion of being their own boss, their own supervisor, their own harshest critic. Han revolutionized our understanding of contemporary power through 4 interlocking revelations. First, his diagnosis of Achievement Society as the new mechanism of control, where we exploit ourselves more ruthlessly than capitalism ever could. Second, his analysis of how digital technology creates voluntary panopticons, surveillance systems we build and maintain ourselves enthusiastically. Third, his development of psychopolitics, power that operates not through repression but through programming our desires and emotions. Fourth, his exposure of how neoliberalism makes us complicit in our own domination by promising unlimited self-realization. We'll trace the complete arc of Han's critical philosophy, from burnout culture and self-exploitation through digital surveillance and the destruction of contemplative life to his vision of aesthetic resistance and what lies beyond capitalist subjectivity. As he writes in Psychopolitics, neoliberal power employs a technology of power that does not negate or repress the subject, but seeks to realize it. This is why Han's work feels urgent rather than merely interesting. He explains why late capitalism feels simultaneously liberating and suffocating, why we experience ourselves as free while becoming more controlled than ever before, and why traditional forms of resistance, strikes, protests, refusal, seem inadequate to our current predicament. The revolution already happened. We lost, and we called it empowerment. Part 1. The Achievement Society and its Subjects. Han makes a deceptively simple observation. We no longer live in the world Michel Foucault described, the disciplinary society that Foucault mapped so precisely, with its prisons, schools, factories, and hospitals, all functioning as mechanisms of external control, has given way to something far more subtle and, ultimately, more effective. Han identifies this transformation as the emergence of Achievement Society, where subjects discipline themselves more efficiently than any external authority ever could. Foucault's disciplinary society operated through what Han calls the negativity of prohibition. It was fundamentally a society of should not, a world structured by external commands, visible surveillance, and clear boundaries between authority and subject. The Panopticon, Foucault's central metaphor, required guards and watchtowers, institutional walls and timetables. Resistance was possible precisely because power remained external and therefore identifiable. But Han argues that this entire apparatus has become obsolete. The disciplinary society has been replaced by what he terms the achievement society, a social formation that operates through an entirely different logic. As Han puts it, the achievement society is the society of can-do. Its modal verb is can as opposed to should. This linguistic shift from should to can represents nothing less than a revolution in the mechanics of social control. Consider how this transformation manifests in contemporary life. Your smartphone doesn't command you to check it. It simply makes checking possible. Convenient. Irresistible. LinkedIn doesn't force you to optimize your professional profile. It offers you the opportunity to unlock your potential. The gig economy doesn't conscript workers. It promises them the freedom to be their own boss. Each of these examples illustrates Han's central insight. Apparent liberation becomes more effective control. The genius of achievement society lies in its elimination of external resistance. When power operates through possibility rather than prohibition, opposition becomes virtually impossible. You cannot rebel against your own opportunities. You cannot resist your own potential. The modal verb can creates what Han calls the violence of positivity, a systematic aggression against natural human limitations, disguised as empowerment and self-realization. This shift produces what Han identifies as the entrepreneur of the self, subjects who experience themselves as autonomous, whilst engaging in more intensive self-exploitation than any external authority could impose. As Han observes in his book Psychopolitics, everyone is an entrepreneur of his or her own self. People are now auto-exploiting until they burn out. The achievement subject works longer hours, accepts greater responsibility, and internalizes more pressure than the disciplinary subject ever endured, all whilst feeling free. The psychological consequences of this transformation are devastating. Achievement society promises unlimited potential whilst creating unprecedented levels of anxiety, depression, and burnout. The elimination of external constraints doesn't produce freedom, but rather internal compulsions that are more totalizing than any external authority. When every limitation appears as a personal failure rather than a structural boundary, subjects lose the capacity for what Han calls sovereign no, the ability to refuse, to limit, to say enough. This is why Han argues that achievement society represents not progress beyond disciplinary power, but rather its perfection. The achievement subject disciplines themselves more thoroughly than any guard, surveils themselves more constantly than any camera, and punishes themselves more harshly than any institutional authority. They do so whilst experiencing this intensified control as liberation, making resistance not just difficult, but psychologically inconceivable. Byung-Chul Han identifies positive thinking as the ideological foundation that makes achievement society so devastatingly effective. Unlike traditional forms of power that operate through prohibition and external constraint, the achievement society governs through what Han calls the violence of positivity, a systematic elimination of negativity that promises unlimited possibility whilst destroying the very capacities that make human experience meaningful. The modal verb can becomes the linguistic signature of this new form of control. As Han observes in The Burnout Society, the society of positivity is dominated by the modal verb can. Its plural form, yes, we can, epitomizes the positivity of the achievement society. Barack Obama's campaign slogan perfectly captures how achievement society operates, not by telling us what we cannot do, but by insisting that anything is possible through individual effort and positive attitude. This isn't merely optimism. It's a systematic restructuring of consciousness that eliminates the possibility of saying no, of recognizing limits, or of questioning whether endless expansion and optimization might themselves be problematic. The genius of positivity lies in its ability to accelerate production by removing all obstacles to endless activity. Traditional power structures required external enforcement, police, surveillance, punishment. But positive subjects police themselves, driven by the intoxicating promise that they can achieve anything if they just maintain the right attitude and work hard enough. There's no need for external coercion when subjects have internalized the demand for constant self-improvement and perpetual availability. Yet this elimination of negativity destroys precisely those human capacities essential for meaning-making and genuine experience. Han recognizes that negativity, in the form of limits, boundaries, resistance, and the capacity to say no, actually enables depth and contemplation. As he puts it, negativity is productivity. It brings forth narration and interpretation. The ability to reject, to pause, to encounter obstacles that cannot be immediately overcome or optimized away. These supposedly negative experiences are what allow for reflection, wisdom, and authentic self-knowledge. Constant positivity prevents the kind of deep attention necessary for genuine creativity and understanding. When everything must be approached with enthusiasm and possibility, when every setback must be reframed as an opportunity for growth, when resistance itself becomes another challenge to overcome through positive thinking, the mind never stops long enough to question whether this endless activity serves any meaningful purpose. Positive subjects become trapped in what Han calls hyperactivity, frantic motion that feels productive but leads nowhere. The violence of positivity operates through saturation rather than deprivation. As Han explains, the violence of positivity does not deprive, it saturates. It does not exclude, it exhausts. This saturation prevents discrimination between what enhances life and what diminishes it. When everything must be embraced positively, when every demand for optimization and performance must be met with enthusiasm, subjects lose the capacity to reject what is genuinely harmful or meaningless. This creates a totalitarian sameness disguised as infinite possibility. Positivity eliminates what Han calls society's immune system, the capacity to recognize and reject what is foreign, harmful, or simply incompatible with human flourishing. Without this discriminating capacity, subjects become unable to resist the endless demands of achievement society, even when those demands are destroying their health, relationships, and sense of purpose. Perhaps most profoundly, the pathology of positivity creates what Han identifies as the disappearance of the other. Authentic experience requires the capacity to encounter what challenges, limits, or transforms us, what cannot be immediately integrated into our existing framework of understanding. But positivity's demand for seamless integration eliminates the friction necessary for genuine growth and learning. Byung-Chul Han identifies a peculiar transformation in the nature of exploitation under neoliberal capitalism. The achievement subject becomes their own taskmaster, internalizing capitalist logic so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from personal identity. This represents something far more insidious than traditional forms of workplace domination. Where earlier capitalism required external overseers, surveillance systems, and disciplinary mechanisms to extract labor, achievement society generates subjects who exploit themselves more efficiently than any boss ever could. Han's striking formulation from Psychopolitics captures this perfectly. Auto-exploitation is more efficient than allo-exploitation because it is accompanied by a feeling of freedom. The entrepreneur of the self works longer hours, accepts more responsibility, and pushes harder than any external authority could demand, because the exploitation feels like self-realization. The freelancer never stops working because every moment represents potential productivity. The self-help enthusiast treats personal development as a full-time occupation, constantly optimizing, improving, and enhancing their human capital. This creates what Han calls the disease of freedom, a psychological collapse that occurs precisely where external constraints are minimal. People in highly regulated societies often experience less psychological distress than those in supposedly free achievement societies. The paradox reveals itself through burnout, which Han describes with characteristic precision. Burnout syndrome occurs when the soul overheats. This overheating results not from external pressure, but from internal demands that recognize no limits, no boundaries, no natural stopping points. The efficiency of self-exploitation lies in its elimination of traditional resistance mechanisms that made earlier forms of capitalism unstable. Achievement subjects cannot develop class consciousness because they identify as individual entrepreneurs rather than collective laborers. There can be no revolution when everyone believes they are their own boss. As Han observes, the neoliberal regime is not a class society in the classical sense. It does not consist of classes that display mutual antagonism. This eliminates the possibility of collective action, whilst intensifying individual suffering. Achievement society's promise of unlimited potential creates impossible expectations that guarantee failure and self-blame. The ideology that you can be anything becomes a form of psychological torture when structural limitations make most possibilities unavailable to most people. Burnout emerges not as individual pathology, but as social symptom, revealing how achievement society systematically produces the very problems it claims to solve. Part 2. Burnout Society and the Exhausted Self. Burnout has become the signature pathology of our era, yet we persistently misunderstand its nature. Byung-Chul Han reveals that what we experience as personal failure represents something far more sinister: the systematic production of psychological collapse by neoliberal achievement, society itself. As Han observes in The Burnout Society, burnout is not a purely individual fate, but rather a social pathology of our times. This epidemic of exhaustion, depression, and anxiety across wealthy societies exposes structural violence, masquerading as individual inadequacy. The cruel irony lies in who suffers most. Burnout strikes hardest among high achievers who have most completely internalized achievement society's demands. The successful entrepreneur collapses after building their third startup. The accomplished academic burns out whilst pursuing tenure. The dedicated healthcare worker breaks down after years of selfless service. These aren't failures of character or resilience. They're predictable outcomes of a system that guarantees psychological destruction for those who succeed within its terms. Han's analysis reveals how profoundly burnout differs from classical forms of worker alienation. Industrial capitalism produced oppressed workers who could recognize their exploitation and organize resistance. The factory worker understood that management extracted surplus value from their labor. This external oppression, whilst brutal, remained visible and therefore resistible through collective action. The exhausted self inhabits a more complex prison. As Han explains, the exhausted, depressive individual is not able to can anymore. This is why the achievement society produces depressives and people who fail. Burnout involves self-exploitation that feels like freedom and personal choice. You weren't forced to check emails at midnight. You chose to demonstrate dedication. You weren't compelled to skip lunch for another meeting. You prioritized productivity. The violence appears as voluntary participation in your own destruction. This shift from external oppression to internal exploitation transforms the very possibility of resistance. The alienated worker could identify the boss as enemy. The burnt-out individual sees only personal inadequacy. Where industrial capitalism produced class consciousness, achievement society generates shame, self-blame, and therapeutic intervention. The problem appears to lie within rather than without. Achievement society's genius lies in redirecting social problems toward individual therapy. What previous generations would have understood as collective struggles against unjust conditions now becomes personal pathology, requiring professional treatment. The expansion of psychiatric categories pathologizes normal responses to abnormal social conditions. Anxiety about economic precarity becomes generalized anxiety disorder. Exhaustion from impossible workloads becomes chronic fatigue syndrome. Despair about climate collapse becomes clinical depression. Han observes in Psychopolitics, neoliberalism privatizes even stress. It depicts it as a matter of individual failure and responsibility. Therapeutic culture directs attention away from structural critique toward personal adjustment and self-optimization. Rather than questioning why work demands have become impossible to meet, we develop better coping strategies. Rather than challenging systems that produce widespread psychological distress, we expand access to mental health services. This therapeutic turn serves achievement society's interests perfectly. It absorbs social contradictions into individual treatment whilst leaving underlying structures intact. The burnt-out worker doesn't organize for shorter hours. They practice mindfulness. The exhausted parent doesn't demand better social support. They attend therapy. Resistance transforms into self-improvement. Political action into personal healing. Yet burnout also contains seeds of its own critique. The exhausted body represents an unconscious strike against impossible demands for constant performance. When you cannot get out of bed, cannot answer another email, cannot maintain the relentless pace of optimization, your body rebels against the tyranny of endless productivity. Achievement society has declared war on time itself. Not merely on wasted time, but on any temporal experience that cannot be measured, optimized, or converted into productive output. Byung-Chul Han reveals how this represents a fundamental assault on human nature, eliminating what he calls the contemplative dimension essential for psychological and spiritual flourishing. Vita contemplativa, which Aristotle ranked higher than vita activa, has no place in the modern active society. Han's observation cuts to the heart of our temporal crisis. Achievement society cannot tolerate moments that don't produce quantifiable results. Meditation becomes mindfulness for enhanced productivity. Rest transforms into recovery for better performance. Even leisure must be optimized for maximum benefit, tracked through apps that gamify relaxation itself. This elimination of what Han calls dead time destroys the temporal rhythms essential for authentic human experience. Your smartphone ensures every moment can be filled with activity, information, or stimulation. The quiet spaces between activities, once opportunities for reflection, integration, or simply being, vanish under the pressure to remain constantly productive, constantly improving, constantly engaged. Han identifies a fundamental tension that achievement society refuses to acknowledge. Humans require contemplation, and rest not as luxuries, but as psychological necessities. These aren't the absence of activity, but different kinds of activity that enable genuine thought and authentic experience. Only a contemplative lingering opens up access to the beautiful and to the true, he observes. The acceleration of time prevents the slow processes of integration, meaning-making, and deep understanding that distinguish human life from mere biological functioning. The cult of efficiency systematically destroys practices essential for meaning-making through what Han analyzes as temporal acceleration, a form of violence against human nature itself. Efficiency eliminates the useless activities that actually make life worth living. Play without purpose, contemplation without agenda, celebration that serves no strategic goal. The demand for constant optimization prevents the patient attention that enables authentic encounter with beauty. Acceleration makes impossible the experience of duration, which is constitutive of happiness. Han writes in The Scent of Time. Duration, the felt experience of time unfolding rather than rushing past, becomes impossible when every moment must justify itself through productivity metrics. Your calendar fills with back-to-back meetings. Your commute becomes podcast consumption time. Your evening relaxation requires apps to track sleep optimization. This temporal acceleration becomes profoundly self-defeating, destroying the very human capacities that make productivity meaningful in the first place. Speed eliminates the temporal space necessary for genuine selfhood to develop and flourish. The demand to constantly produce and optimize the self prevents the patient, contemplative work of actually becoming a self. When the self must be continuously produced and optimized rather than allowed to unfold naturally, being yourself transforms into another form of labor. The contemplative practices that once enabled authentic self-knowledge, solitude, reflection, patient attention to inner experience, become impossible luxuries in a society that demands constant performance. This creates the conditions for what Han diagnoses as the contemporary epidemic of depression, the exhausted failure to maintain the impossible demand of perpetual self-optimization, whilst simultaneously discovering who you actually are beneath the performance. The depressive individual, Han argues, represents the inevitable casualty of a society that demands endless self-realization, whilst simultaneously making authentic selfhood impossible. The depressive individual is unable to measure up to the demands of the achievement society, he observes, but this inability reveals not personal inadequacy but the inherent contradiction within neoliberalism's promise of freedom through self-optimization. Depression emerges most frequently in societies that offer the greatest apparent freedom for self-expression and personal development. This paradox exposes the fundamental deception at the heart of achievement society. The more we are told we can become anything, the more exhausted we become trying to fulfill this impossible mandate. The self, rather than being discovered or expressed, must be continuously produced, optimized, and performed according to market demands. Han identifies how neoliberalism transforms selfhood into a form of labor. The neoliberal regime makes the individual responsible for his or her own self, which must be continually optimized, he writes in Psychopolitics. Your personality becomes your brand, your authentic self becomes your competitive advantage. Your emotional life becomes human capital, requiring strategic development. The pressure to be yourself becomes indistinguishable from the pressure to work on yourself endlessly. This creates a profound paradox that Han traces through contemporary psychological suffering. Authentic selfhood requires time, patience, and the capacity to simply be rather than constantly become. Yet, achievement society demands perpetual self-improvement. continuous adaptation, and relentless optimization. The more effort we invest in becoming ourselves, the further we drift from any possibility of genuine being. Traditional therapeutic approaches fail because they treat as individual pathology what Han recognizes as social symptom. Depression gets reduced to brain chemistry or personal trauma, whilst the social conditions that systematically produce psychological distress remain unexamined. Therapy itself becomes another form of self-work, another project of optimization that exhausts rather than heals. The therapeutic culture that promises to help us find ourselves actually reinforces achievement society's core demand that we take responsibility for our own psychological state and work continuously to improve it. Cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness apps, and self-help programs all operate according to the same logic that created the problem: the assumption that the self is something to be managed, optimized, and perfected through individual effort. Han's insight cuts deeper than conventional critiques of mental health treatment. The epidemic of depression and anxiety in wealthy societies doesn't represent a failure of individual coping mechanisms, but rather the unconscious recognition that the promises of achievement society are fundamentally false. Depression becomes a form of resistance, albeit an unconscious one, to impossible social demands. This psychological suffering points toward the need for fundamental changes in how we organize social life rather than better individual treatments. The depressed individual intuitively grasps what achievement society cannot admit: that the demand for endless self-realization is itself a form of violence against human nature. Part 3. Digital Panopticon and Voluntary Surveillance. Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon represented the perfect disciplinary machine, a circular prison where guards could observe all inmates without being seen themselves. The genius lay not in constant watching, but in the possibility of being watched at any moment. Prisoners, never knowing when they were observed, began to monitor their own behavior continuously. What Bentham could only imagine in 18th century architecture, digital technology has realized with unprecedented perfection. Byung-Chul Han recognizes that our smartphones, social media platforms, and digital services have created something far more effective than Bentham's prison. In the Swarm, Han observes that the digital panopticon does not work with Windows. It is transparent. The analog panopticon was opaque, where Bentham's design required physical architecture and human guards. Digital surveillance operates through voluntary participation. We carry our own monitoring devices, eagerly documenting our locations, purchases, relationships, and thoughts, without any external coercion. The revolutionary shift lies in transforming surveillance from punishment into pleasure. Traditional surveillance created resistance because subjects recognized it as oppression. Digital surveillance, however, feels like freedom, self-expression, and social connection. Han captures this perfectly. The smartphone is a digital confessional. Facebook is the global synagogue, the global church of the digital. We don't resist digital monitoring. We actively participate in it, sharing our most intimate moments and thoughts with platforms that commodify our data. This voluntary self-exposure eliminates the fundamental problem that plagued every historical surveillance system: resistance. When subjects eagerly document themselves, surveillance becomes invisible and total. The pleasure of sharing, the addiction to likes and comments, the fear of social isolation, these make digital self-surveillance feel necessary rather than imposed. We monitor ourselves more thoroughly than any secret police ever could, creating detailed profiles of our desires, fears, relationships, and daily routines. Han identifies how privacy transforms from a right to be protected into a barrier to be overcome. Digital culture treats privacy as suspicious, antisocial, potentially dangerous. The demand for transparency becomes totalitarian, eliminating the hiddenness and interiority necessary for genuine selfhood. When everything must be shared, documented, and made visible, we become data points rather than human beings, quantified subjects rather than free individuals. This digital panopticon doesn't just watch us, it shapes us. Through algorithms that predict and influence our behavior, platforms don't merely surveil, they actively construct the subjects they monitor. We become what our data suggests we are, trapped in feedback loops that reinforce and amplify our documented preferences whilst eliminating the possibility of genuine change or growth. Byung-Chul Han identifies big data as the mechanism through which human behavior transforms into predictable patterns and marketable commodities. Digital platforms extract value from every aspect of human experience, converting the most intimate details of daily life into algorithmic fuel. As Han observes in Psychopolitics, big data is a very efficient psychopolitical instrument that makes it possible to acquire a comprehensive knowledge of the dynamics of communication and thought. Every click, search, purchase, and interaction becomes data that reveals psychological patterns and enables behavioral prediction with unprecedented precision. This process operates through feedback loops that actively shape future choices and desires. Han's crucial insight reveals that big data doesn't simply observe behavior. The algorithm learns from your past actions to predict future ones, then uses those predictions to influence what you encounter next. Your Netflix recommendations, Amazon suggestions, and social media feeds create a personalized reality bubble that gradually molds your preferences according to patterns the system has identified and seeks to reinforce. The quantified self movement reveals how life becomes metrics, reducing human existence to optimization problems that can be solved through data analysis and algorithmic intervention. Fitness trackers monitor steps, heart rate, and sleep patterns. Mood apps quantify emotional states. Productivity software measures focus, efficiency, and output. These technologies transform subjective experiences into objective measurements that can be compared, improved, and optimized according to algorithmic standards of performance. Han observes that the quantified self is the neoliberal self that transforms itself into an efficient system. Spontaneity, the sacred, that cannot be captured in data, but remain essential for authentic living. The quantified self becomes a project of endless self-optimization, where every aspect of existence must be measured, tracked, and improved according to metrics determined by technological systems, rather than personal meaning or social relationships. Algorithmic prediction enables behavioral modification as a new form of social control. Han's analysis reveals how big data creates the possibility of influencing behavior before subjects become conscious of their own desires. Predictive algorithms don't merely respond to existing preferences. They actively shape future choices by presenting options, recommendations, and advertisements at precisely the moments when subjects are most susceptible to influence. This represents power that operates through programming the unconscious rather than conscious persuasion or external coercion. The disappearance of unconscious and unpredictable elements constitutes the elimination of human freedom and dignity. Han argues that freedom requires the capacity for surprise, spontaneity, and actions that cannot be predicted or controlled by external authorities. As he states in Psychopolitics, freedom is a synonym for the incalculable. Big data's promise of total knowledge and perfect prediction represents the elimination of human freedom in its most fundamental sense, creating subjects who become transparent to algorithmic analysis whilst remaining opaque to themselves. Your Instagram story expires in 24 hours, but the anxiety of crafting it lasts much longer. Byung-Chul Han sees this perpetual performance as symptomatic of a deeper transformation in how digital platforms have restructured human relationships themselves. Social media promises connection whilst systematically eliminating the conditions that make authentic encounter possible. Han argues that digital communication fundamentally prevents genuine meeting with otherness because it reduces others to sources of validation rather than partners in mutual transformation. The digital swarm does not develop a we. It lacks the spirit that would be necessary for a we. This isn't simply about the quality of online conversations being shallow, though they often are, but about how digital platforms structurally eliminate the vulnerability, patience, and openness to being changed that authentic relationship requires. Consider how social media interaction actually functions. You scroll through curated highlights, double-tap approval, perhaps leave a comment designed to showcase your own wit or wisdom. The other person becomes a content provider for your feed, just as you become content for theirs. There's no genuine encounter because there's no real risk. You can unfollow, mute, or block anyone who challenges your worldview or makes you uncomfortable. The algorithm ensures you primarily see content that confirms your existing preferences and beliefs. This creates what Han identifies as the exhaustion of constant self-presentation. Digital platforms make privacy impossible whilst demanding that authenticity itself become a performance. Every meal, every vacation, every achievement must be documented and optimized for engagement. The smartphone has become a mobile confessional, Han observes, but unlike traditional confession, this one never grants absolution, only the demand for more content. The psychological cost is profound. You develop a split between the performed self, always attractive, successful, engaged with interesting projects and beautiful locations, and the lived self that experiences boredom, failure, loneliness, and mundane daily reality. This gap generates anxiety because maintaining the performance requires constant labor. Your personal brand needs regular updates. Your engagement metrics demand attention. Your online persona requires careful curation to remain competitive in the attention economy. Han reveals why digital validation becomes addictive whilst failing to satisfy deeper human needs. Likes and shares provide quantified approval, measurable feedback that triggers dopamine release, but they simulate recognition without providing it. Genuine recognition requires being known in your complexity and accepted despite your flaws. Digital metrics offer the opposite. Approval based on your ability to present an optimized version of yourself that generates engagement. The metrics of digital success, followers, likes, shares, comments, simulate community, whilst eliminating what makes authentic community possible. Real community involves obligations, commitments, and constraints. You must navigate disagreement, compromise your preferences, and remain accountable to others, even when it's inconvenient. Digital networks allow you to curate your connections, avoiding anyone who might challenge or disappoint you. The other, as mystery, as seduction, disappears in total communication. Han writes in The Agony of Eros. Digital platforms promise transparency and connection, but deliver the opposite. A world where others become predictable sources of content and validation rather than mysterious beings capable of surprising and transforming. The political implications extend beyond personal relationships. When citizens become data points and engagement metrics, democratic discourse transforms into entertainment and personal branding. Digital platforms optimize for engagement rather than truth, rewarding outrage, simplification, and tribal identification over complex thought and genuine deliberation about collective values. This creates the foundation for understanding Han's broader critique of transparency as a totalitarian demand. Part 4. The Transparency Society and its Discontents. Transparency has become the unquestioned virtue of our digital age, the solution to corruption, the path to accountability, the foundation of trust. Yet Byung-Chul Han delivers a shocking diagnosis. Transparency is a totalitarian demand. This isn't hyperbole or philosophical provocation. It's a precise analysis of how our seemingly democratic ideal has become a form of violence against the very set conditions that make human dignity, authentic relationships, and genuine politics possible. The Transparency Society eliminates what Han calls the hiddenness essential to human life. When everything must be visible, accountable, and immediately accessible, we destroy the protected spaces where people can think, change their minds, make mistakes, and develop authentic relationships. The demand for total openness creates what Han identifies as a society of control, where visibility becomes the mechanism of domination. Every private conversation becomes potential evidence, every personal struggle becomes public performance, every moment of uncertainty becomes weakness to be exploited. This reveals the crucial distinction between legitimate political accountability and the totalitarian demand for total visibility. Democratic oversight requires that officials explain their actions and decisions to the public, but it doesn't require that every conversation, every doubt, every private moment of deliberation become transparent. Han recognizes that healthy political systems need what he calls backstage areas, the informal conversations where real work happens, the private spaces where people can explore ideas without immediate judgment, the protected deliberation where minds can change without public humiliation. The Transparency Society eliminates these essential spaces. When every political conversation must be recorded, every meeting must be public, every doubt must be confessed, authentic political work becomes impossible. Politicians perform transparency rather than engaging in genuine deliberation. Citizens consume political information rather than participating in collective decision-making. The demand for openness creates a politics of pure visibility, where image management replaces substantive engagement with difficult questions. This destruction of political privacy connects to Han's deeper insight about trust and knowledge. He observes that trust is only possible in a state between knowledge and ignorance. Trust requires the capacity to act without complete information, to have faith in others despite uncertainty, to take risks based on character rather than surveillance. The Transparency Society eliminates this possibility by demanding complete knowledge about everyone and everything. When we know everything about others, their browsing history, their private conversations, their past mistakes, their current doubts, we don't trust them more. We trust them less. Complete transparency creates paranoia rather than confidence, suspicion rather than security. The demand to see everything makes genuine relationship impossible because it eliminates the vulnerability and risk that make trust meaningful. Han recognizes that relationships based on total visibility become relationships of control rather than connection. This connects to the Transparency Society's most profound violence, its elimination of secrets, mysteries, and the sacred. Han argues that certain aspects of human experience, love, creativity, spiritual development, authentic selfhood, require hiddenness to flourish. These experiences cannot survive total visibility because they depend on what cannot be reduced to information, processed by algorithms, or controlled through surveillance. The sacred requires mystery. Love requires privacy. Creativity requires protected experimentation. Authentic selfhood requires spaces where people can be uncertain, contradictory, and incomplete without immediate judgment. The transparency society destroys these possibilities by reducing everything to data that can be analyzed, shared, and managed. It eliminates the irreducible mystery that makes life meaningful by demanding that everything become transparent information. This creates the foundation for understanding how transparency destroys politics itself. Byung-Chul Han's diagnosis of our transparency society reveals a profound crisis at the heart of democratic life. Politics, he argues, is not simply a matter of processing information or making data visible to citizens. Rather, as he writes in The Swarm, politics is not just a matter of information. Rather, it is a matter of developing a vision of society. This distinction cuts to the core of what transparency culture has destroyed in our political systems. When everything must be immediately visible, measurable, and publicly scrutinized, politics becomes reduced to administrative management rather than genuine democratic action. The transparency society transforms political leadership into information processing, where politicians become data managers, rather than visionaries capable of imagining alternative futures and mobilizing collective action to realize them. Han observes that this reduction eliminates the creative, transformative dimensions of political action that democracy requires. The paradox runs deeper than mere administrative efficiency. Political action, Han argues, requires spaces hidden from immediate public scrutiny for authentic development. Genuine political work happens in informal conversations, private reflections, and protected spaces where people can explore ideas, build relationships, and change their minds without immediate public judgment. These backstage areas are not corruption or secrecy. They are essential conditions for the experimentation, vulnerability, and gradual consensus building that effective democratic action demands. Yet transparency culture eliminates precisely these spaces. Han notes that transparency makes politics impossible by subjecting every political act to immediate scrutiny and judgment. When politicians cannot explore ideas privately, test proposals informally, or build relationships gradually, political action becomes performative rather than substantive. Every gesture must be calculated for public consumption rather than democratic effectiveness. This transformation affects citizens as profoundly as politicians. The information society converts political engagement from active participation into passive consumption of data and entertainment. Digital platforms optimize political content for engagement rather than democratic participation, creating information environments that reward outrage, simplification, and tribal identification, rather than complex thought and collaborative action. Han's insight reveals how the abundance of political information paradoxically reduces political agency. Citizens become overwhelmed with data whilst being provided no meaningful channels for collective action. They consume political content like entertainment, responding with likes, shares, and comments, rather than engaging in the patient work of democratic deliberation and community building. The transparency society thus destroys the fundamental conditions that make democratic politics possible. Democracy requires citizens who can engage with complexity, tolerate uncertainty, and work together despite disagreement. These capacities develop through trust, patience, and protected spaces for genuine democratic deliberation, precisely what transparency culture systematically undermines. When every political interaction must be immediately visible and subject to instant judgment, the slow, patient work of building democratic consensus becomes impossible. citizens lose the ability to change their minds, explore difficult questions, or engage with political opponents as fellow human beings rather than ideological enemies. Politics becomes a spectacle of predetermined positions rather than a genuine process of collective decision-making about shared futures. The promise of digital connection masks a profound tragedy: the systematic destruction of the conditions that make genuine intimacy possible. Byung-Chul Han reveals how surveillance capitalism doesn't simply monitor our relationships, it transforms their very nature, making authentic human connection structurally impossible. When every conversation might be recorded, every gesture tracked, every moment of vulnerability potentially weaponized, the protected space essential for love and friendship disappears entirely. Han's insight cuts to the heart of what intimacy actually requires. In The Agony of Eros, he writes, "Love requires a protected space. The total communication and total networking of digital media destroys this protected space. This isn't merely about government surveillance or corporate data collection. It's about how the knowledge that our interactions exist in potentially public digital form changes the fundamental nature of human communication. Genuine intimacy depends on the capacity for vulnerability, spontaneity. It requires the ability to share thoughts, feelings, and experiences without strategic calculation about how they might be interpreted, stored, or used against us later. The digital Panopticon eliminates this possibility entirely. When lovers text, they know their messages exist as data. When friends share secrets over social media, they understand these confessions live on servers owned by corporations with their own interests. Even private conversations carry the implicit awareness that nothing digital is truly private, that governments can access communications, that platforms can analyze sentiment, that employers might review messages, that hackers might expose intimate details. This knowledge doesn't simply add risk to authentic expression. It makes authenticity itself impossible by introducing a calculating consciousness into every moment of potential connection. The psychological split this creates runs deeper than mere caution. Constant visibility forces subjects to develop what Han identifies as a performed self that exists alongside but separate from the lived self. The performed self is the optimized, sanitized version we present to digital platforms, carefully curated to avoid misunderstanding, designed to project acceptable emotions and opinions, constructed to survive scrutiny by unknown audiences with unpredictable reactions. Meanwhile, the lived self, with its contradictions, uncertainties, shameful thoughts, and evolving understanding, must remain hidden, creating an exhausting internal division. Han recognizes that authenticity requires precisely what surveillance eliminates: the capacity for privacy, hiddenness, and the gradual unfolding of selfhood that cannot survive total transparency. Authentic personal development depends on useless activities, daydreaming, experimenting, making mistakes, processing experiences without external judgment, that become impossible when every moment might be observed and evaluated. The demand for constant visibility eliminates the restorative function of solitude and the exploratory function of privacy, both essential for developing genuine responses to life's challenges rather than simply performing acceptable reactions, is less than #0. Wu. Jinghao Dayu. This creates what Han identifies as the fundamental psychological cost of living without privacy: the elimination of the internal space necessary for growth, change, and authentic self-development. In The Transparency Society, he writes, "The human being is not a transparent being. The human being is a being that has secrets. These secrets aren't necessarily shameful. They're the private thoughts, half-formed ideas, emotional experiments, and gradual realizations that constitute the actual process of becoming human. Privacy protects not wrongdoing, but the essential human capacity for authentic development. The transparent society promises self-expression whilst systematically destroying the conditions that make authentic self-expression possible. Part 5. Psychopolitics and the colonization of the mind. Foucault mapped the evolution of modern power from sovereign violence to disciplinary control, showing how authority shifted from public executions to subtle surveillance of bodies and populations. But Byung-Chul Han identifies a further evolution that Foucault couldn't anticipate. Power now operates through programming minds, desires, and emotional responses, rather than controlling physical behavior. This represents psychopolitics, a qualitatively different form of control that makes subjects complicit in their own domination. As Han writes, in Psychopolitics, psychopower is more efficient than biopower. For, instead of working with prohibitions and deprivations, it works with please and fulfill. Where biopolitics managed life through institutions like hospitals, schools, and prisons, psychopolitics operates through the production of subjectivity itself. Neoliberal power doesn't repress desires but manufactures them, creating subjects who genuinely want what power needs them to want. Your Netflix algorithm doesn't force you to watch particular content. It shapes your preferences so that choosing feels authentic whilst serving corporate objectives. Han observes, neoliberal power employs a technology of power that does not negate or repress the subject, but seeks to realize it. This makes resistance extraordinarily difficult because subjects experience control as freedom, self-realization, and authentic choice rather than external oppression. The efficiency of psychopolitics lies in eliminating the resistance that made earlier forms of power unstable. Subjects want to be controlled in ways that feel like liberation. Rather than operating through laws, prisons, and physical force, psychopolitical control works through marketing, therapy, culture, and self-help movements. You police yourself more efficiently than any external authority by internalizing the demand for constant self-optimization and emotional regulation. Han captures this perfectly. The achievement subject exploits itself more efficiently than the disciplinary subject, which is exploited by others. This neoliberal production of subjectivity transforms consumer culture, the wellness industry, and personal development movements into mechanisms that shape desires, emotions, and self-understanding whilst serving capitalist accumulation. Your meditation app, fitness tracker, and productivity system feel like tools for individual growth and authentic self-expression. Yet they function as technologies for extracting value from your interiority. This creates the foundation for understanding emotional capitalism as the colonization of human feelings by market logic, turning your emotional life into a resource to be optimized and exploited. Byung-Chul Han reveals how neoliberalism has achieved something far more insidious than traditional economic exploitation. It has colonized human emotions themselves, transforming our most intimate feelings into resources to be optimized and exploited. This represents a fundamental shift in how power operates in contemporary society. Rather than suppressing emotions or controlling them through external force, emotional capitalism commodifies feelings, making them productive assets that subjects must manage and deploy strategically. As Han writes in Psychopolitics, emotions are being exploited today because they are assumed to be a source of productivity and performance. The wellness industry exemplifies this colonization perfectly. Mindfulness meditation, once a spiritual practice aimed at transcending worldly concerns, becomes a productivity tool designed to enhance focus and reduce stress-related inefficiency. Happiness transforms from a spontaneous human experience into a performance requirement, something you must actively cultivate and maintain to remain professionally viable and socially acceptable. Emotional intelligence emerges not as authentic human capacity for empathy and connection, but as a measurable job skill that can be trained, assessed, and leveraged for career advancement. This transformation extends throughout contemporary work life, particularly in service industries where employees must perform emotional labor alongside their physical tasks. Restaurant servers must appear genuinely happy and enthusiastic regardless of their actual feelings. Customer service representatives must maintain caring, patient demeanors whilst dealing with frustrated clients. Healthcare workers must project compassion and competence even when exhausted or overwhelmed. Han identifies this as effective labor, the exhausting work of managing emotional states to meet external demands for optimized performance. But emotional capitalism extends far beyond formal employment. It permeates all social relationships, making subjects responsible for managing their own and others' emotional states as a form of unpaid work. Parents must not only care for their children but also optimize their emotional development. Partners must work on their relationships through therapeutic techniques and communication strategies. Friends must provide emotional support whilst maintaining positive, uplifting interactions. Every emotional exchange becomes a site of potential labor and performance. This eliminates the possibility of authentic emotional expression and spontaneous feeling. All emotions become performances that serve economic or social functions rather than genuine human responses to lived experience. The result is what Han describes as the complete colonization of human interiority by market logic, leaving no space outside capitalist relations where authentic feeling might emerge. This colonization makes resistance particularly difficult because it operates through the promise of personal fulfillment and authentic self-expression rather than external coercion. Subjects become complicit in their own emotional exploitation by believing that managing their feelings serves their own interests rather than external power. The therapeutic culture that emerges from this dynamic systematically reframes social problems as individual psychological issues, requiring personal intervention rather than structural change, creating the foundation for understanding how contemporary power operates through the management of subjectivity itself. Neoliberalism privities even stress. Byung-Chul Han's stark observation cuts to the heart of how contemporary power operates, not through external coercion, but through the systematic reframing of social problems as individual psychological issues. What Han calls psychopolitics achieves something remarkable. It convinces subjects that their suffering results from personal inadequacy rather than structural injustice. The anxiety you feel scrolling through housing prices, the depression that follows another round of redundancies, the attention problems that emerge from constant digital interruption. These become medical conditions, requiring therapeutic intervention rather than political responses, demanding social change. This represents a profound shift in how power manages dissent. Traditional disciplinary society controlled bodies through external surveillance and punishment. Psychopolitics operates more subtly, colonizing the mind itself. When inequality reaches historic levels, when environmental destruction accelerates, the therapeutic state responds not by addressing root causes, but by expanding psychiatric categories to pathologize normal responses to abnormal conditions. Your distress at living in an unsustainable system becomes generalized anxiety disorder. Your inability to focus amidst constant digital stimulation becomes attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Your exhaustion from precarious employment becomes clinical depression. Han reveals how this expansion serves power by directing attention away from structural critique toward individual treatment. The therapeutic discourse promotes a seductive illusion that social problems can be solved through personal healing and growth rather than collective action and transformation. Therapy becomes another form of what Han calls self-work, the endless project of optimizing, adjusting, and improving oneself that exhausts subjects whilst leaving unchanged the conditions that create suffering. You become responsible for adapting to circumstances that make you sick rather than changing those circumstances. The pharmaceutical management of social discontent represents psychopolitics' ultimate expression. Psychiatric medication manages symptoms whilst preventing authentic encounter with suffering that might lead to genuine transformation or political resistance. The medicalization of normal human responses eliminates the possibility that psychological distress serves as a signal that social change is necessary. Your pain becomes a brain chemistry problem requiring chemical correction, not a meaningful response to meaningless conditions requiring political action. This therapeutic colonization points towards something deeper: modernity's destruction of the ritual practices and communal bonds essential for human flourishing, revealing the crisis of symbolic order that underlies contemporary suffering. Part 6. The disappearance of ritual and community. Traditional societies, Han argues, operated within what he calls symbolic orders, complex webs of meaning that extended far beyond individual preference or market calculation. These weren't simply belief systems but comprehensive frameworks that connected daily life to larger purposes, seasonal rhythms to cosmic significance, individual identity to collective memory, religious traditions, cultural ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and community rituals created what Han describes as techniques for making oneself at home in the world. They provided stable sources of meaning that didn't require constant personal achievement or economic justification. The symbolic order functioned as a kind of cultural inheritance, passed down through generations, not because it was useful in any measurable sense, but because it created the very possibility of shared meaning. A harvest festival wasn't efficient. It interrupted productive work, required elaborate preparation, involved seemingly wasteful expenditure of resources. But it connected individuals to agricultural cycles, community history, and collective identity in ways that transcended any cost-benefit analysis. These practices created what Han calls temporal anchors, moments when linear time opened into something deeper, more resonant, more lasting. Modern rationality systematically destroys these symbolic frameworks through what Han identifies as the tyranny of functional efficiency. Market logic cannot tolerate activities that serve no quantifiable purpose. Bureaucratic systems eliminate practices that don't produce measurable outcomes. The neoliberal emphasis on optimization subjects all human activities to economic calculation, systematically removing anything that cannot justify itself in terms of productivity or profit. Traditional ceremonies become inefficient. Religious observances become unproductive. Community rituals become wasteful. This process accelerates under digital capitalism, which promises more efficient forms of connection, whilst eliminating the temporal rhythms that make genuine community possible. Social media platforms simulate the functions of traditional gathering. They connect people, share information, create collective experiences, but they operate according to the logic of engagement and data extraction rather than symbolic meaning-making. The result is what Han calls pseudo-community, networks that feel like connection, but lack the deeper symbolic foundations that create lasting bonds. The consequences extend far beyond nostalgia for lost traditions. Han argues that the destruction of symbolic order creates an existential vacuum that manifests as widespread anxiety, depression, and social fragmentation, without shared temporal experiences, without rhythms of celebration, contemplation, and collective meaning-making. Individuals become isolated in what Han calls the eternal present of optimization. Life becomes a series of performance metrics rather than a meaningful narrative embedded in larger purposes. Rituals stabilize life, Han writes in The Disappearance of Rituals. They make life last. Without these stabilizing practices, individuals lose connection to continuity between past, present, and future. They become vulnerable to what Han identifies as psychopolitical manipulation. Isolated subjects seeking meaning and connection become ideal targets for consumer culture's promises of individual self-realization and digital platforms' simulation of community. This symbolic destruction creates the psychological conditions that neoliberalism exploits. The hunger for meaning that traditional symbolic orders once satisfied becomes a market opportunity. Self-help culture, lifestyle brands, and digital communities promise to fill the void left by the elimination of genuine ritual practices. But these substitutes operate according to market logic rather than symbolic logic. They create consumers rather than community members, individual optimization rather than collective meaning. Byung-Chul Han draws a crucial distinction that cuts to the heart of our digital predicament. Genuine community emerges from shared practices and deep commitments, whilst networks operate through utility and information exchange. As Han observes in the Swarm, the digital swarm does not develop a we. It lacks the spirit that would be necessary for a we. This isn't merely about different forms of social organization. It's about fundamentally different ways of being human together. Authentic community requires shared obligations, mutual responsibility. When you participate in genuine community, you're transformed by that participation. Your identity becomes partially constituted by your relationships and responsibilities to others. Networks, by contrast, connect individuals only as long as the connection serves their separate interests. The moment utility disappears, so does the connection. Digital networks simulate community, whilst eliminating the obligations and constraints that make community possible. Social media creates the appearance of connection without the substance of genuine relationship. You can accumulate hundreds of followers, engage in constant communication, and feel perpetually connected. Yet Han reveals this as a sophisticated form of isolation. Digital communication eliminates the friction, difficulty, and mutual responsibility that authentic community requires. Consider how online interactions can be terminated instantly without consequence. Block, unfriend, unfollow. These actions create connections that feel like community, but lack the durability, commitment, and transformative power of genuine social bonds. Han notes that digital networks optimize for individual convenience rather than collective flourishing. The algorithm serves your preferences, not your growth or your capacity for genuine encounter with otherness. This produces what Han identifies as the loneliness of networked individualism despite unprecedented connectivity. Digital connection intensifies isolation by preventing authentic encounter with difference. Genuine community requires the capacity to be changed by others, to encounter perspectives that challenge your assumptions, to participate in shared practices that transcend individual preference. Digital networks eliminate these transformative encounters by allowing you to curate your social environment completely. Your social media feeds become echo chambers not because of corporate manipulation alone, but because network logic itself eliminates the challenging encounters that community requires. As Han writes in The Agony of Eros, the other, as mystery, as seduction, disappears in total communication. When everything is transparent, When all communication is optimized for efficiency and preference satisfaction, the otherness of others disappears. Community requires exclusion, boundaries, and shared sacrifice. Authentic belonging requires the capacity to distinguish between inside and outside, us and them, sacred and profane. This isn't about creating hostile divisions, but about recognizing that meaningful belonging involves shared commitments that limit individual freedom in exchange for collective meaning and mutual support. Digital networks promise connection without constraint, belonging without obligation, identity without sacrifice. This creates the illusion of community whilst eliminating its essential characteristics. You can feel connected to thousands whilst remaining fundamentally uncommitted to anyone. The network preserves your autonomy by avoiding the mutual obligations that would transform your individual identity through genuine participation in something larger than yourself. This transformation of community into network creates the conditions for capitalism's colonization of every aspect of social life, turning even festivals and celebrations into consumption opportunities rather than communal practices that create genuine shared experience. Capitalism transforms our most sacred moments into shopping opportunities. Byung-Chul Han reveals how market logic colonizes festivals, holidays, and celebrations. In the Disappearance of Rituals, he demonstrates that genuine celebration creates time outside ordinary productivity, providing rhythms of rest and renewal that resist the relentless acceleration of modern life. Rituals are techniques of temporal architecture, Han observes. They transform being into a dwelling, yet commercialized holidays eliminate precisely these contemplative and communal dimensions. Christmas becomes a retail season, Easter, a chocolate marketing campaign, New Year's Eve, an entertainment spectacle. The sacred time that once interrupted economic activity now extends market logic into our most meaningful moments. Where authentic festivals once created collective pauses in productivity, we now have consumption opportunities disguised as celebration. The difference proves crucial. Authentic celebration requires the suspension of normal economic activity and individual competition in favor of collective joy, gratitude, and renewal. Han emphasizes that rituals interrupt the everyday and create islands of deceleration, providing the temporal space necessary for meaning-making and authentic community formation. Genuine festivals involve collective participation in activities that serve no productive purpose but create shared meaning and community identity. Wu Jinghao Dayu, consumer culture cannot replace these essential functions. Entertainment and shopping offer passive consumption rather than active participation, individual acquisition rather than shared creation, personal gratification rather than connection to larger purposes. Han's analysis reveals how authentic celebration serves fundamental human needs that market mechanisms systematically destroy. Genuine festivals create sacred time that differs qualitatively from ordinary time, providing opportunities for transcendence, community bonding, and renewal of collective identity. This temporal quality cannot be manufactured or purchased. It emerges only through collective participation in activities that resist the logic of optimization and efficiency. The loss of these celebratory practices contributes directly to the temporal acceleration and meaninglessness that characterizes contemporary life. Han demonstrates that rituals provide the temporal anchors necessary for human flourishing and social stability. Without genuine festivals, we lose the natural rhythms of rest and renewal that make sustained activity possible and meaningful. This elimination creates a foundation for understanding why aesthetic experience and contemplative practices represent potential forms of resistance to neoliberal acceleration. Han's vision suggests that art and contemplation might provide alternatives to the logic of endless optimization, offering pathways back to the temporal dwelling that authentic celebration once provided. Part 7. The Aesthetics of Resistance. Byung-Chul Han reveals a profound irony at the heart of our achievement society. The practices that appear most useless from productivity's perspective hold the greatest political significance. Contemplation, meditation, philosophical reflection, these activities produce no measurable outcomes, generate no data, contribute nothing to GDP. They appear wasteful, inefficient, entirely beside the point of modern life. Yet this apparent uselessness reveals their revolutionary potential. As Han writes in The Scent of Time, it is an end in itself. This purposelessness makes contemplation dangerous to a system that demands everything: serve optimization, productivity, measurable results. Achievement society cannot tolerate activities that don't contribute to performance metrics. Every moment must be justified through output, every practice validated through its contribution to efficiency or self-improvement. Meditation becomes mindfulness training for better focus at work. Reading transforms into skill acquisition for career advancement. Even rest must justify itself through enhanced productivity. The neoliberal subject internalizes this logic completely, experiencing guilt and anxiety whenever engaged in activities that don't advance measurable goals. Contemplative practices resist this temporal violence by creating alternative rhythms that prioritize being over doing, depth over speed, meaning over efficiency. This resistance operates at the most fundamental level of human experience: attention itself. Han recognizes that contemplation requires the kind of patient, sustained focus that achievement society systematically destroys. Multitasking, connectivity, the demand for constant availability, these forces fragment attention into scattered, reactive responses. Contemplative practices work against this fragmentation, developing capacities for sustained attention, discrimination, and authentic experience. They create what Han calls islands of deceleration that resist the temporal demands of acceleration culture. These islands prove essential for human development in ways that productive labor cannot replicate. Contemplative practice develop wisdom, compassion, and the capacity for genuine encounter with otherness, qualities that cannot be produced through effort or optimization, but emerge through patient attention and receptive awareness. They create psychological conditions necessary for authentic choice, distinguishing between authentic desires and manufactured needs. This discrimination becomes crucial for resisting psychopolitical control, which operates precisely by making artificial needs feel natural and inevitable. Han's insight reveals contemplation not as escape from political engagement, but as essential preparation for genuine political action. Effective resistance requires clarity, patience, and sustained attention that only contemplative practices provide. Political action without contemplative foundation becomes reactive, superficial, easily co-opted by the systems it seeks to resist. Contemplation develops strategic thinking, authentic motivation, and sustained commitment that genuine social transformation requires. It prepares the ground for encountering genuine otherness and difference, creating space for aesthetic experience that opens beyond the narrow confines of achievement, society's relentless optimization. Byung-Chul Han identifies authentic aesthetic experience as one of the few remaining domains where subjects can encounter genuine otherness, what challenges, transforms, and exceeds their existing understanding. In The Agony of Eros, he declares, "The beautiful is the totally other." This insight, cuts against achievement, society's relentless demand for control, optimization, and measurable results. Genuine aesthetic experience requires exactly what our culture systematically eliminates: receptivity, patience, and the capacity to be changed by what we encounter. Authentic art resists commodification precisely because it creates experiences that cannot be reduced to information, consumption, or utility. When you stand before a painting that genuinely moves you, or hear music that shifts something fundamental in your understanding, you're experiencing what Han calls the transformative encounter with otherness. This isn't about acquiring cultural capital or consuming entertainment. It's about allowing yourself to be wounded by beauty, to have your existing categories of understanding challenged and expanded. Han draws a crucial distinction between art as commodity and art as transformative encounter. The contemporary art market and cultural industry work systematically to neutralize art's transformative potential by reducing it to investment opportunity, status symbol, or entertainment product. When art becomes another asset class or Instagram backdrop, it loses its capacity to create the kind of disruptive encounter with otherness that authentic aesthetic experience provides. This neutralization isn't accidental. It serves the broader project of psychopolitical control. Authentic aesthetic experience requires time, attention, and vulnerability that consumer culture cannot provide or tolerate. Genuine encounter with art involves risk, the possibility of being changed, challenged, or transformed in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled. Han observes that authentic beauty wounds us by revealing the limitations of our existing understanding and opening us to possibilities we hadn't imagined. This wounding quality makes genuine aesthetic experience dangerous to a system that requires predictable, optimizable subjects. Aesthetic education becomes politically significant precisely because it develops the capacity for discrimination in a society that reduces everything to the same. The ability to distinguish between authentic and inauthentic experience, genuine and manufactured beauty, transformative and merely entertaining art. These discriminations require the kind of patient attention and discriminating awareness that psychopolitical control seeks to eliminate. When you develop aesthetic sensitivity, you're cultivating resistance to the homogenization and commodification that characterize contemporary culture. This aesthetic training provides something more fundamental: the capacity to recognize and value what cannot be reduced to market logic. The person who can distinguish between genuine and fake beauty in art develops parallel capacities in political, social, and personal life. Aesthetic judgment becomes training in the kind of attention and discrimination necessary for both authentic living and effective political action. This creates the foundation for understanding how Eastern philosophical traditions might provide resources for critiquing Western rationalism and activism, pointing toward alternative models of selfhood and action that resist the logic of endless optimization and control. Byung-Chul Han brings a unique perspective to contemporary philosophy through his deep engagement with both Eastern and Western intellectual traditions. As a Korean philosopher who studied extensively in Germany, Han possesses an almost singular vantage point for understanding how different philosophical approaches might address the pathologies of our digital age. His incorporation of Buddhist and Taoist concepts isn't merely academic or exotic. It represents a strategic deployment of Eastern wisdom as a resource for critiquing and resisting Western rationalism's obsession with productivity, control, and endless striving. Han's engagement with Eastern philosophy emerges from his recognition that Western thought, particularly in its neoliberal form, has created a peculiar trap. The very rationality and activism that once promised human liberation have become mechanisms of control and exhaustion. Achievement society demands constant optimization, endless self-improvement, and relentless productivity. Against this backdrop, Eastern philosophical traditions offer something genuinely different, not alternative methods, for achieving the same Western goals, but entirely different ways of understanding what it means to live well. The concept of Wu Wei, or non-action, provides perhaps the most direct challenge to Western productivity culture. Han draws on Taoist philosophy to show how Wu Wei differs fundamentally from Western notions of passivity or laziness. Wu Wei involves acting in harmony with natural rhythms and processes, rather than forcing outcomes through sheer effort and will. This represents what Han calls a different form of activity, one that achieves more by doing less. Consider how this challenges the logic of achievement society. Where neoliberal culture demands constant activity, optimization, and measurable progress, Wu Wei suggests that effective action often requires patience, stillness, and the wisdom to know when not to act. The executive checking emails at midnight, the student cramming for exams whilst consuming energy drinks, the entrepreneur working 18-hour days, all represent the Western obsession with forced productivity that Wu Wei fundamentally questions. Han's exploration of Eastern emptiness concepts provides another crucial resource for resistance. Buddhist traditions understand emptiness not as lack or void, but as what Han describes as a fullness that cannot be grasped. This emptiness represents freedom from the ego-driven attachments that achievement society exploits and intensifies. Where Western culture emphasizes individual identity, personal achievement, and permanent self-realization, Buddhist practices of non-attachment suggest entirely different possibilities for human flourishing. The implications extend directly to our digital predicament. Social media platforms profit from our attachments to self-image, to validation, to the constant stream of information and stimulation. Eastern practices that cultivate emptiness and non-attachment provide practical alternatives to this endless self-optimization. Meditation practices that develop the capacity to let go create space for authentic experience beyond the metrics and measurements that define neoliberal subjectivity. Yet Han remains careful about the limits of cross-cultural philosophical synthesis. Eastern concepts cannot simply be transplanted into Western contexts without consideration of cultural and historical differences. The mindfulness industry's commodification of meditation represents exactly this kind of problematic appropriation, taking Eastern practices and packaging them as productivity tools for Western achievement culture. Han's approach demonstrates a more sophisticated possibility. Effective resistance requires understanding both the specific conditions of contemporary psychopolitical control and the resources available from different philosophical traditions. His work shows how creative synthesis can draw on multiple traditions whilst remaining grounded in concrete analysis of current conditions. Part 8. Digital Detox and the Recovery of Attention. Digital platforms have transformed human consciousness into a resource to be extracted and monetized, creating what Byung-Chul Han identifies as cognitive capitalism. In his work Psychopolitics, Han reveals how this system operates. Attention is the currency of the psychopolitical regime, and digital platforms have developed sophisticated techniques for capturing and monetizing human attention, making consciousness itself a site of capitalist extraction and control. The mechanism operates through what Han calls the systematic destruction of sustained attention. Digital technology fragments consciousness through constant interruption, notification, and the demand for immediate response to multiple information streams. Your smartphone buzzes with notifications, Your computer displays pop-up alerts, and your social media feeds demand constant scrolling and engagement. This creates what appears to be heightened connectivity and productivity. But Han identifies a more sinister reality. The hyperattention that characterizes our present time is not attention at all, because it lacks the patience and depth that make authentic attention possible. This fragmentation prevents complex thought and genuine experience in ways that serve psychopolitical control. When consciousness is constantly interrupted and divided, the sustained focus necessary for deep thinking, authentic experience, and genuine encounter with otherness becomes impossible. Multitasking eliminates the contemplative space where critical analysis might emerge. The endless stream of information creates an illusion of engagement, while systematically preventing the kind of focused attention that might question the system itself. The destruction of attention also eliminates lasting memory formation and meaningful experience. Memory requires the kind of sustained attention and contemplative processing that digital culture systematically prevents. When experiences are constantly interrupted and fragmented, they cannot be integrated and reflected upon in ways that create meaningful memories. Han describes how the constant flow of information prevents the integration necessary for experiences to become transformative elements of identity and understanding. This creates what he calls the hell of the same, endless stimulation that feels like experience, but lacks the depth and integration that make experience genuinely meaningful. The political consequences are profound. Distracted citizens cannot engage in serious deliberation, making democracy impossible. Democracy requires citizens capable of sustained attention, complex thinking, and patient deliberation about collective problems, precisely the capacities that digital culture systematically destroys. When consciousness is fragmented and commodified, the cognitive and emotional foundations necessary for democratic participation erode. This analysis reveals why boredom becomes a form of resistance. In a system that profits from constant stimulation and response, the capacity to be bored, to exist in unstimulated contemplative space, represents a fundamental challenge to cognitive capitalism. Boredom recovers the possibility of genuine attention and authentic experience by creating space outside the attention economy's relentless demands. Boredom has become the enemy of our age. We flee from it with desperate urgency, filling every unstimulated moment with notifications, scrolling, podcasts, or background noise. Yet Byung-Chul Han argues that this flight from boredom represents one of the most destructive aspects of our achievement society. In The Burnout Society, he makes a counterintuitive claim that challenges our entire relationship to empty time. Boredom is not a negative phenomenon. It is a fundamental mood that creates space for something new. This isn't romantic nostalgia for pre-digital life. Han's analysis cuts deeper, revealing how the systematic elimination of unstimulated time prevents the kind of inner development that makes authentic selfhood possible. Boredom provides the temporal space necessary for genuine reflection, creative insight, and authentic desire to emerge. When achievement society demands constant productivity and stimulation, it eliminates precisely the useless time that actually makes human life meaningful and creative. Consider what happens in those rare moments when your phone dies and you find yourself waiting somewhere without entertainment. The initial discomfort you feel isn't weakness. It's your psyche beginning to encounter itself without external mediation. Han recognizes that this discomfort signals the beginning of authentic self-encounter, the moment when consciousness turns inward and begins to generate rather than merely consume. The elimination of boredom through constant entertainment and stimulation prevents genuine self-encounter in profound ways. Digital culture has engineered solutions for every moment of potential emptiness. Instagram for waiting in queues, podcasts for commuting, streaming for evenings, endless content for weekends. This systematic filling of temporal gaps prevents the kind of inner silence and receptivity that authentic self-knowledge requires. Han's insight penetrates to the heart of digital colonization. Genuine selfhood emerges not through constant activity and stimulation, but through patient attention to inner experience and the capacity to tolerate emptiness and uncertainty. The fear of boredom drives people to constant digital consumption, preventing the kind of authentic encounter with themselves that might lead to genuine transformation or resistance to external control. This creates a vicious cycle where subjects become increasingly dependent on external stimulation to feel alive, whilst simultaneously losing touch with their own inner resources for meaning-making and creativity. The result is what Han calls the Burnout society, a culture of subjects who are simultaneously hyperactive and depleted, constantly busy yet fundamentally empty. The distinction between chosen solitude and enforced isolation becomes crucial here. Voluntary disconnection represents a political act in the context of digital surveillance and attention extraction. Han's analysis reveals how genuine solitude differs fundamentally from loneliness by providing space for authentic self-encounter and creative development, rather than mere isolation from others. When you choose to disconnect from digital platforms and create technology-free time, you're reclaiming attention and consciousness from commercial exploitation. This isn't antisocial behavior. It's resistance to psychopolitical control. Han observes that solitude is not a privation but a completion, recognizing that authentic selfhood requires periods of withdrawal from external demands and stimulation. This chosen solitude becomes the foundation for what Han calls genuine desire. Authentic desire emerges from inner emptiness and receptivity, rather than external stimulation and suggestion. Consumer culture prevents genuine desire by constantly providing manufactured needs and artificial stimulation that keep subjects in a state of perpetual dissatisfaction and craving. Boredom creates the space necessary for distinguishing between authentic desires that emerge from genuine selfhood and manufactured needs that serve external interests. In the silence of unstimulated time, you begin to sense what you actually want, rather than what you've been told to want. Byung-Chul Han recognizes that effective resistance to digital colonization cannot take the form of complete withdrawal from technological society. Such total rejection becomes practically impossible for most people, whilst simultaneously missing the deeper point about how digital culture operates. Han argues that complete avoidance of technology often leads to social isolation and economic marginalization, effectively removing oneself from the very spaces where resistance might matter most. Instead, he advocates for strategic engagement with technology that preserves human agency and authentic experience. The key lies in distinguishing between technology as tool versus technology as environment. When we use smartphones, social media platforms, or digital work tools for specific purposes whilst maintaining awareness of their effects on consciousness, we retain some measure of control. The danger emerges when these technologies become the environment within which all thinking and relating occurs. Han observes that resistance requires maintaining spaces and practices that exist outside technological mediation, creating what he calls islands of deceleration in the accelerated flow of digital culture. Creating technology-free spaces and times becomes essential for preserving the capacity for contemplation and genuine social interaction. Han's analysis reveals how human flourishing requires protected spaces outside digital surveillance and commercial exploitation. Authentic experience demands the kind of sustained attention and genuine encounter that digital platforms systematically prevent through their design for engagement, maximization, and data extraction. Regular periods of disconnection, daily meditation time, technology-free meals, digital Sabbaths provide the temporal space necessary for authentic self-encounter and genuine relationship. These practices aren't merely personal wellness strategies but forms of resistance that preserve the psychological and social capacities needed for meaningful opposition to digital capitalism. When we create regular intervals outside the attention economy, we maintain access to forms of experience that surveillance capitalism cannot capture or commodify. Han emphasizes that conscious technology use involves maintaining awareness of how digital tools affect attention, emotion, and social connection. This means using technology strategically whilst preserving practices that develop sustained attention, genuine community, and authentic political engagement. The goal isn't to eliminate technology but to prevent it from structuring consciousness entirely. The collective dimension proves crucial because individual solutions remain insufficient without broader social change. Han's vision points toward alternatives to achievement society and post-capitalist possibilities that don't depend on surveillance capitalism and attention extraction. Personal practices of digital resistance create the foundation for this broader transformation by developing the capacities that systemic change requires, the ability to think deeply, relate authentically, and act collectively outside the logic of digital acceleration and competitive individualism. Part 9. The Future of Work and Post-Capitalist Possibilities. Work has colonized human existence so completely that we struggle to imagine life organized around any other principle. Byung-Chul Han reveals how achievement society has transformed work from economic necessity into the primary measure of human worth, making productive labor the foundation not just of survival, but of identity, social recognition, and personal meaning. As Han observes in The Burnout Society, work has become a religion. The factory has been replaced by the fitness studio. The goal is no longer to discipline the body for the purpose of production, but to optimize it. We've moved beyond external coercion to internalized compulsion, where individuals drive themselves toward exhaustion in pursuit of achievement. This transformation runs deeper than individual psychology. Han shows how modern societies organize time, space, education, and social relationships around the demands of productive labor. Universities become job training centers. Leisure becomes work-life balance, still defined in relation to work. Even rest serves productivity, as we optimize sleep and exercise to enhance performance. The rhythm of daily life follows work schedules, whilst social status derives from professional identity. When people meet, they ask, "What do you do?" Meaning, "How do you work?" The question reveals how thoroughly work has become the organizing principle of human existence. Yet this colonization of life by work occurs precisely when technological development could liberate us from such dependence. Han identifies the fundamental contradiction of our moment. Digital technology and artificial intelligence create unprecedented possibilities for reducing necessary labor whilst increasing material abundance. But capitalist ownership of technology ensures that productivity gains serve profit accumulation rather than human liberation. Automation eliminates jobs whilst intensifying pressure on remaining workers to be constantly available, endlessly productive, perpetually optimizing themselves for economic competition. This creates what Han sees as the central paradox of late capitalism: technological unemployment alongside work intensification. As algorithms handle routine tasks, human workers face demands for creativity, flexibility, and emotional labor that extend far beyond traditional working hours. The smartphone becomes a leash, making every moment potentially productive time. The boundary between work and life dissolves not through liberation but through work's expansion into every domain of existence. Moving beyond work society requires what Han calls fundamental transformation in how we organize economic distribution, social recognition, and personal meaning. This means developing forms of human flourishing that don't depend on productive contribution to capitalist accumulation. The difficulty of imagining such alternatives reveals how thoroughly achievement ideology has colonized our understanding of human purpose. We can barely conceive of social organization not based on competitive productivity, of personal identity not grounded in professional accomplishment, of economic distribution not tied to wage labor. Han suggests that liberation from work demands both technological capability and cultural transformation. Post-work society requires not just material abundance but new forms of meaning and recognition based on human flourishing rather than economic output. This points toward possibilities like universal basic income as potentially breaking the link between survival and wage labor, creating space for forms of human development currently impossible within work society's constraints. Yet such transformation faces the enormous challenge of overcoming achievement, society's psychological and institutional structures that make work appear as natural and necessary as breathing itself. Byung-Chul Han sees universal basic income as potentially revolutionary, precisely because it severs the fundamental link between survival and wage labor. This isn't merely economic policy. It's a direct challenge to the core assumption of achievement society that humans must justify their existence through productive contribution. When guaranteed economic security exists independent of work performance, the coercive foundation of wage labor begins to crumble. Han argues that genuine freedom requires being liberated from the compulsion to work, and UBI creates the material conditions where this liberation becomes possible for the first time in industrial society. The psychological implications run deeper than economic security. Han recognizes that UBI could transform subjectivity itself by eliminating the anxiety and competition that fuel achievement society's psychological violence. When survival no longer depends on outperforming others, the relentless pressure for self-optimization and personal branding that characterizes neoliberal subjectivity begins to lose its grip. Economic security enables the contemplative life and genuine community that wage labor systematically prevents through its demands for constant availability and competitive individualism. Without the threat of economic precarity, people might rediscover forms of human development and social contribution that don't fit market logic. This connects to Paul Lafargue's radical insight about the right to be lazy, which Han sees as anticipating contemporary problems with work-based identity and achievement society. Lafargue's 19th century socialist critique argued that laziness represents genuine human liberation from the artificial demands of capitalist productivity. His declaration that the right to be lazy is sacred challenged the work ethic as a form of false consciousness that prevents authentic human flourishing. Han recognizes how this historical critique becomes even more relevant under contemporary conditions where the work ethic has become totalizing through achievement, society's demand for voluntary self-exploitation, and constant performance optimization. The deeper philosophical point concerns human development beyond economic productivity. Han argues that meaningful human capacities, wisdom, creativity, compassion, aesthetic appreciation, require sustained attention and contemplative development that wage labor systematically prevents. These authentic human capacities cannot develop within the temporal demands and competitive pressures of productive labor. They require the kind of unhurried attention and contemplative space that only becomes possible when economic security is guaranteed independent of work performance. This creates the foundation for understanding post-growth society and ecological wisdom as requiring economic systems based on sufficiency rather than endless accumulation and competitive maximization. Byung-Chul Han reveals how achievement society's relentless demand for growth creates both individual burnout and ecological catastrophe through the same destructive logic. The psychological mechanisms that drive self-exploitation, the belief that more is always better, the inability to recognize natural limits, the compulsive need for constant optimization, also fuel environmental destruction through the impossibility of infinite economic expansion on a finite planet. Han captures this perfectly. The logic of growth is the logic of cancer. Just as cancer cells multiply without regard for the organism's well-being, achievement society pursues endless accumulation without considering ecological or human limits. This connection runs deeper than mere analogy. The same mindset that makes individuals exhaust themselves chasing productivity targets also drives corporations to extract resources without restraint and governments to prioritize GDP growth over environmental health. The entrepreneur who works 18-hour days and the mining company that strips forests both operate from identical assumptions: that maximization equals success, that limits are obstacles to overcome, that more is inherently better than enough. Han argues that contemplative practices and aesthetic appreciation offer genuine alternatives to this consumptive lifestyle. Real satisfaction emerges from depth of experience rather than quantity of consumption. When you develop contemplative awareness through meditation, artistic appreciation, or philosophical reflection, you discover forms of fulfillment that don't depend on material accumulation or status acquisition. A single piece of music, deeply heard, provides richer experience than hours of distracted entertainment consumption. A moment of genuine presence offers more satisfaction than endless scrolling through digital feeds. This isn't romantic escapism but practical wisdom. Contemplative practices reduce the psychological hunger that drives both individual suffering and ecological destruction. When you learn to find meaning in being rather than having, in quality rather than quantity, the compulsive need for more begins to dissolve. You start recognizing the difference between genuine needs and manufactured desires, between authentic satisfaction and artificial stimulation. Han extends this insight to economic systems themselves. Post-growth society requires fundamental changes in how we measure success, organize production, and distribute resources. Ecological sustainability demands economic systems that prioritize human flourishing and environmental health over profit maximization and endless accumulation. This means developing new metrics beyond GDP, measuring well-being, ecological health, social cohesion, and cultural vitality rather than just economic output. The transition requires what Han calls sufficiency economics, systems designed around having enough rather than having more. This doesn't mean poverty or deprivation, but rather abundance redefined. Instead of measuring wealth by accumulation capacity, we might measure it by resilience, beauty, health, and time for contemplation. Instead of designing cities for maximum consumption, we might design them for maximum livability. Han recognizes that ecological crisis requires more than technological solutions because environmental problems reflect deeper spiritual and psychological problems with how modern societies understand human purpose and relationship to nature. Solar panels and electric cars matter, but they won't solve climate change if we maintain the same growth-obsessed mindset that created the problem. We need what he calls ecological wisdom, the kind of contemplative awareness and aesthetic sensitivity that achievement society systematically destroys through its demand for constant productivity, optimization. This ecological wisdom emerges from recognizing our embeddedness in natural cycles rather than our separation from them. It means understanding that human well-being depends on ecosystem health, that individual fulfillment connects to collective flourishing, that present satisfaction matters more than future accumulation. Part 10. Love and Recognition in the Digital Age. Byung-Chul Han identifies something devastating happening to love in our achievement-oriented culture. In The Agony of Eros, he reveals how neoliberal subjectivity transforms love from a genuine encounter with otherness into yet another project of self-enhancement and optimization. Love is being laid to waste by the contemporary compulsion of performance and optimization, capturing how the same logic that drives career advancement and personal branding now infiltrates our most intimate relationships. Achievement subjects approach romantic partnerships with the calculating mindset they apply to professional networking or fitness regimens. They seek partners who enhance their social status, optimize their happiness metrics, and contribute to their individual self-realization projects, rather than encountering genuine otherness that might challenge or fundamentally transform them. The other person becomes a resource for personal fulfillment rather than a mysterious being whose difference might disrupt our carefully constructed self-image. This transformation occurs through consumer culture's relentless teaching that relationships should function like lifestyle choices, providing maximum satisfaction with minimal risk or constraint. Han recognizes how this eliminates the commitment, vulnerability, and mutual transformation that authentic love requires. When we approach relationships as optimization projects, we systematically avoid the very elements that make love meaningful: the unpredictability of genuine encounter, the risk of being changed by another person, the acceptance of what we cannot control or improve about our beloved. Love requires a protected space, which total communication and total networking destroy, identifying how digital connectivity undermines the hiddenness and mystery essential to intimate connection. Dating apps epitomize this destruction by reducing potential partners to profiles that can be evaluated, compared, and optimized like consumer products. Algorithmic matching promises to eliminate uncertainty and vulnerability by providing compatible partners based on data analysis rather than authentic meeting between unique individuals. This digital reduction of love to market logic eliminates the gradual revelation and risk that genuine relationships require. When we can swipe through hundreds of potential partners, evaluating them against our predetermined criteria and optimization goals, we lose the capacity for the patient, vulnerable encounter with otherness that allows authentic love to develop. The mystery that makes another person genuinely other, and therefore capable of transforming us, disappears into algorithmic compatibility scores. Han's insight reveals why achievement society makes genuine love impossible. Authentic love requires accepting and even celebrating what we cannot control, predict, or optimize about another person. But achievement subjects, trained to constantly improve themselves and their circumstances, become unable to tolerate the otherness, unpredictability, and fundamental mystery that make love transformative rather than merely satisfying. This creates the foundation for understanding why digital validation can never substitute for genuine recognition, and what authentic encounter with otherness might require in a culture systematically eliminating hiddenness and mystery. Byung-Chul Han draws a sharp line between genuine recognition and digital validation, a distinction that reveals the profound poverty of our networked age. Recognition, as Han understands it, means encountering and affirming what is genuinely different about another person, their otherness, their mystery, their irreducible uniqueness. In the Swarm, he writes, recognition means letting the other be other. This isn't simply tolerance or acceptance. It's the active appreciation of qualities, perspectives, and depths in others that we don't understand, control, or possess ourselves. Genuine recognition requires patience, sustained attention, and the willingness to be changed by what we discover. It's a form of vulnerable encounter that opens us to dimensions of human experience beyond our immediate comprehension or desire. Digital validation operates through an entirely different logic. Social media platforms optimize for engagement and confirmation rather than authentic encounter with otherness. The like button, the comment thread, the share count. These mechanisms provide quantified approval that simulates recognition whilst systematically preventing genuine encounter with difference. When you post a photo or share a thought online, you're not seeking to be known in your otherness. You're seeking confirmation of what others already expect, desire, or recognize about you. The algorithm ensures that your content reaches people likely to validate your existing identity rather than challenge or expand it. This creates the illusion of recognition whilst actually preventing the slow, patient work of being genuinely known and appreciated for qualities that might surprise, confuse, or transform those who encounter you. The psychological hunger for authentic recognition becomes desperate in a society that offers only quantified approval. Han recognizes that digital validation creates addiction precisely because it fails to satisfy the deeper human need for genuine recognition and belonging. The endless pursuit of likes, followers, and digital metrics reveals the profound loneliness of not being genuinely known while simultaneously preventing the authentic encounter that might satisfy this need. Each notification provides temporary relief from isolation, but because digital validation confirms sameness rather than appreciating otherness, it can never fulfill the human longing to be recognized and valued for who we actually are, including the parts of ourselves that don't fit easily into digital categories or algorithmic optimization. Genuine recognition cannot be automated, optimized, or reduced to data points because it requires distinctly human capacities, empathy, imagination, contemplative patience, that emerge only through sustained relationship and vulnerable encounter. Han understands that authentic recognition develops through the kind of attention that allows us to discover surprising depths, contradictions, and mysteries in others that resist simple categorization. This recognition transforms both the one who recognizes and the one who is recognized, creating the foundation for relationships that transcend the logic of digital consumption and commodification. Love, for Byung-Chul Han, represents one of the last refuges from digital capitalism's relentless commodification of human experience. Yet this refuge exists under constant siege. In The Agony of Eros, Han argues that authentic erotic experience fundamentally depends on encountering what cannot be reduced to information, control, or consumption. Eros is a relationship to the other that eludes the subject's grasp and control. He writes, identifying precisely what digital culture systematically eliminates. The erotic encounter, properly understood, involves accepting mystery, unpredictability, and the transformative possibility of being changed by what we cannot understand or possess about another person. This stands in stark opposition to both pornographic consumption and digital dating platforms, which eliminate mystery entirely. Pornography reduces erotic experience to controllable stimulation, whilst dating apps optimize satisfaction through algorithmic matching that promises to eliminate the uncertainty and vulnerability that make genuine encounter possible. Consider how Tinder's swipe mechanism transforms potential lovers into consumable images, evaluated and discarded in seconds. The app's promise is efficiency. Finding the perfect match through data optimization. Yet this efficiency destroys precisely what Han identifies as essential to erotic experience: the encounter with genuine otherness that resists our categories and expectations. Authentic love requires accepting mystery and hiddenness rather than demanding total transparency and knowledge. Han's analysis reveals how genuine intimacy depends on preserving spaces of privacy and unknowing that allow relationships to remain alive and transformative. The contemporary obsession with transparency, sharing everything, knowing everything, accessing everything, destroys love by eliminating the hiddenness that makes another person genuinely other rather than an extension of ourselves. This creates a fundamental paradox. Authentic love involves knowing someone deeply, whilst accepting that they remain fundamentally mysterious and beyond our complete understanding or control. Digital culture cannot tolerate this paradox. It demands that everything be knowable, trackable, optimizable. Your partner's location, their communications, their browsing history, their emotional patterns, all become data points in the transparent relationship. Yet Han reveals the political dimensions of this destruction. Intimate relationships that resist commodification become forms of social resistance because they challenge the logic of optimization, consumption, and instrumental relationship that characterizes neoliberal society. Genuine love creates protected spaces outside market logic, where people can encounter each other as ends in themselves rather than means to individual satisfaction or self-enhancement. This resistance operates at the level of psychological capacity itself. The abilities that make authentic love possible: patience, vulnerability, commitment to what we cannot control, are precisely the capacities necessary for genuine political solidarity and collective action. Han establishes this crucial connection. The capacity for love and the capacity for political transformation draw from the same psychological resources. Both authentic love and effective political action require encountering otherness, accepting limitation, and committing to relationships that transform us in unpredictable ways. This creates the foundation for understanding why individual transformation and social change necessarily connect rather than compete with each other, pointing toward possibilities for renewal that emerge from the very exhaustion that digital capitalism produces. Part 11. The Politics of Exhaustion and Possibilities for Renewal. Traditional left-wing politics has become exhausted not because its ideals are wrong, but because it operates on assumptions about power and subjectivity that no longer match how contemporary society actually functions. Byung-Chul Han's analysis reveals why progressive movements feel increasingly ineffective. They're fighting yesterday's battles with yesterday's weapons, addressing forms of oppression that achievement society has already transformed beyond recognition. The classical Marxist framework assumes external oppression that workers can identify and resist collectively. Factory owners exploit laborers, capitalists extract surplus value from the working class, and these antagonistic relationships create the material conditions for solidarity and revolutionary consciousness. But Han argues that neoliberal capitalism operates through fundamentally different mechanisms of control. The neoliberal regime is not a class society in the classical sense, he writes in Psychopolitics. It does not consist of classes that display mutual antagonism. Instead, achievement society neutralizes traditional forms of political resistance by making them feel outdated and irrelevant. Psychopolitical control operates by making subjects complicit in their own domination, transforming external coercion into internal compulsion that feels like freedom and personal choice. When your smartphone buzzes with another work email at midnight, you don't experience this as capitalist exploitation. You experience it as your own ambition, your commitment to excellence, your entrepreneurial drive to succeed. This creates a profound political exhaustion that goes beyond mere disillusionment with particular parties or policies. Traditional progressive politics assumes that people will recognize their shared interests as workers, tenants, or consumers facing common structural problems. But achievement society has eliminated the psychological conditions that make such recognition possible. Everyone feels like an entrepreneur responsible for their own fate, competing with others rather than sharing common interests with them. Class consciousness becomes impossible when workers identify as individual entrepreneurs rather than collective laborers. The freelancer struggling to pay rent doesn't see themselves as part of an exploited working class. They see themselves as a small business owner who needs to work harder, develop better skills, build a stronger personal brand. The stressed professional working 70-hour weeks doesn't experience this as capitalist extraction of surplus value. They experience it as their own choice to pursue success and achievement. Han calls this the hell of the same. Isolated individuals competing with each other, whilst believing they are freely choosing their own paths. Traditional political organization becomes impossible because the fundamental structure of social relations has changed. Unions feel irrelevant when everyone thinks they're their own boss. Collective action feels meaningless when problems appear as individual inadequacies rather than structural oppression. This doesn't mean political resistance is impossible, but it does mean that effective resistance requires understanding how contemporary power actually operates. Psychopolitical control functions through the production of subjectivity rather than external coercion, making subjects believe they want what the system needs them to want. Traditional political strategies fail because they assume forms of power and subjectivity that achievement society has already dissolved. The exhaustion of left-wing politics reflects this deeper transformation. Progressive movements offer collective solutions to what appears as individual failure and personal responsibility. They address problems that subjects don't recognize as political, speaking a language of solidarity to people who experience themselves as individual entrepreneurs. Han's most provocative argument emerges from his analysis of achievement society's dependence on voluntary participation. In a system that operates through subjects' willing cooperation in their own exploitation, the refusal to participate becomes a form of political resistance. Idleness is not a vice, but a virtue, Han declares in the Burnout Society, inverting centuries of Protestant work ethic ideology. This isn't mere contrarianism. It's a recognition that in a society organized around constant activity and endless optimization, the refusal to be productive exposes the violence underlying achievement society's demands. Strategic idleness differs fundamentally from laziness. Where laziness represents avoidance or inability to meet responsibilities, strategic idleness involves conscious resistance to impossible demands. It's the deliberate choice not to optimize every moment, not to be constantly available, not to treat leisure time as an opportunity for self-improvement. This form of resistance operates by withdrawing the voluntary participation that neoliberal capitalism requires, revealing how much contemporary control depends on subjects' willing cooperation rather than external coercion. The smartphone exemplifies this dynamic perfectly. The device doesn't force you to check notifications. It simply makes checking so convenient, so apparently necessary, that refusal feels impossible. Strategic idleness means choosing not to respond immediately, not to fill every empty moment with digital stimulation, not to participate in the attention economy's demands for constant engagement. These small acts of refusal accumulate into a broader questioning of the system that presents such choices as inevitable, creating spaces outside productive logic enables the development of alternative forms of consciousness and social relation. Han recognizes that meaningful human development requires what he calls useless time, moments that serve no productive purpose but enable the slow processes of wisdom, creativity, and authentic relationship that make life meaningful. Achievement society colonizes even rest, transforming sleep optimization, meditation apps, and weekend retreats into forms of productivity enhancement. Strategic idleness resists this colonization by protecting spaces where different forms of consciousness become possible. These islands of deceleration create conditions for genuine encounter, with oneself, with others, with the world beyond instrumental calculation. In contemplative traditions, this space is recognized as essential for wisdom development. In political terms, it provides the temporal and psychological conditions necessary for authentic critique and genuine community formation. Without such spaces, resistance remains reactive, trapped within the logic it seeks to challenge. The collective potential of individual acts of withdrawal becomes apparent when understood systematically. Widespread refusal to participate in achievement society's demands creates conditions for broader social transformation. Digital detox, contemplative practice, strategic idleness, these apparently individual responses to burnout develop the capacities necessary for effective collective action. Sustained attention, authentic relationship, genuine political vision, all require the psychological and social conditions that strategic idleness helps create. This establishes the foundation for understanding contemplative revolution as the connection between inner transformation and social change, revealing how personal practices of resistance create the conditions for collective political renewal. Byung-Chul Han offers a startling proposition. Effective resistance to our digital burnout culture requires what he calls contemplative revolution. This isn't mere personal development or spiritual escape, but a fundamental recognition that psychopolitical control operates by programming consciousness itself. As Han puts it, contemplation is a form of resistance. The achievement society doesn't simply exploit our labor, it colonizes our attention, manufactures our desires, and shapes the very forms of awareness through which we experience reality. Traditional political resistance fails because it operates within the same accelerated, reactive consciousness that digital capitalism produces. Contemplative practices, meditation, philosophical reflection, aesthetic appreciation, develop precisely the psychological capacities necessary for recognizing and resisting this deeper level of control. Han's insight reveals why inner change and social change aren't alternative strategies, but necessarily connected dimensions of genuine transformation. Subjects cannot resist forms of power they cannot recognize, and recognition requires the kind of sustained attention and authentic discrimination that only contemplative practice can provide. The digital Panopticon succeeds by keeping consciousness fragmented, distracted, and reactive. Your smartphone notifications aren't just interrupting your thoughts. They're training specific patterns of attention that make deeper forms of awareness nearly impossible. Contemplative practice works against this programming by developing the capacity to distinguish between authentic desires and manufactured needs, genuine community and simulated connection, effective action and reactive response. This creates the psychological conditions necessary for effective political action through what Han sees as the development of sustained attention, emotional regulation, and authentic discrimination. Political action without contemplative foundation becomes reactive, superficial, and easily co-opted by the systems it seeks to resist. The climate movement's cycles of outrage and exhaustion, social media activism's tendency toward performative gestures, progressive politics' capture by the same optimization logic it opposes, all reflect the absence of the patience, clarity, and sustained commitment that genuine social change requires. Contemplative practice develops the capacity for strategic thinking and long-term vision that transcends immediate reaction to current conditions. Han's contemplative revolution ultimately points toward a society organized around human flourishing, rather than economic accumulation. Contemplative awareness reveals the possibility of satisfaction, meaning, and genuine fulfillment that don't depend on constant acquisition, optimization, or competitive achievement. This isn't romantic retreat from political engagement, but the foundation for understanding what authentic alternatives might actually look like, forms of social organization based on wisdom, compassion, and authentic human development rather than productivity, competition. The burnout society collapses not through external resistance but through the development of consciousness that simply no longer finds its promises compelling. Part 12. Conclusion. Byung-Chul Han's philosophical project reveals achievement society, digital surveillance, transparency, culture, and psychopolitics as interconnected elements of a unified system that has perfected control by making subjects complicit in their own domination. We experience ourselves as simultaneously free and trapped, connected yet profoundly isolated, because late capitalism has evolved beyond external coercion into something far more sophisticated, power that operates through the promise of self-realization rather than force. Han's central insight cuts to the heart of our contemporary predicament. The achievement subject exploits itself more efficiently than the disciplinary subject, which is exploited by others. This represents a qualitatively new form of power that eliminates traditional sources of resistance by making control feel like liberation, exploitation feel like self-development, and surveillance feel like social connection. Achievement society creates the psychological conditions that make digital surveillance feel like freedom. We willingly carry tracking devices because they promise to optimize our performance. Transparency culture eliminates the privacy necessary for authentic resistance, whilst psychopolitics programs the very desires that make subjects want their own exploitation. This interconnected analysis explains why individual solutions to social problems consistently fail. We attempt to solve problems using the same logic that created them, trying to optimize our way out of a system built on endless optimization, seeking authentic connection through the very technologies that commodify intimacy, pursuing freedom through practices that increase our integration into systems of control. The neoliberal subject believes themselves free whilst becoming more thoroughly controlled than ever before. Han's lasting contribution provides philosophical tools for understanding that genuine liberation requires both inner transformation and structural change. Psychopolitical control operates by colonizing consciousness itself, which means effective resistance requires contemplative practices that develop authentic discrimination, alongside collective action that creates alternative social institutions. Personal and political transformation are necessarily connected rather than competing approaches to social change. The path beyond our current predicament requires recovering capacities for contemplation, genuine community, and forms of life not organized around productivity. True freedom means learning to resist the demand to optimize ourselves and instead discovering what it means to simply be human. As Han writes in The Scent of Time, only a contemplative, lingering, opens up access to the beautiful and to the true. Han's complete philosophy points toward the possibility of human flourishing based on wisdom, compassion, and authentic relationship, rather than endless optimization, competitive achievement, and digital connection. Genuine liberation requires not just political change, but fundamental transformation in how we understand human purpose and authentic living. A recognition that our deepest freedom lies not in perfecting ourselves, but in learning to be present to what is already here.